ונאמר אמן. יישר כוחך.
Tov. So we've been talking the last couple of nights, Hachodesh hazeh lachem, talking about the moon, the place of the moon in our calendar, the moon in halacha. We mentioned last night Kiddush Levana. Mentioned at the end. So interesting part of the nusach that we have when we say Kiddush Levana after the bracha. So we say Kashem shani loked Kenigsberg ve'eni yachol lengua bach. Kach lo yichlu kol havei lengua b'dorah. Just as we stand and some people go up on their tiptoes, some people start dancing around, jumping up, kiv yachol. We cannot reach the moon, so too our enemies should not be able to reach us. So when man landed on the moon, there were those who said maybe this piska is no longer relevant. Maybe it's not actually, it's no longer factually correct. So Rav Goren, who was not afraid to say controversial things, you know, he said actually based on there are other versions of this tefillah. Based on those versions as well, he said we can't say anymore because there are those. Neil Armstrong did it. So he suggested the nusach should be changed, and the nusach should be Kashem shani loked Kenigsberg ve'eni nogea bach. And I'm not that I cannot touch, not that I cannot reach, but that I'm not reaching. That was the suggestion of Rav Goren. There were others who disagreed, as you have probably noticed that our nusach we still say that. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, for example, already said no, said that there's no need to change it. There's no need. That's not what it means, right? The person who's standing doesn't mean that in theory there's no human being could ever reach the moon. That's irrelevant. The person who's standing now where I am saying the tefillah, right? I'm not, as much as I try and jump, I'm not going to be able to reach the moon. That's not something that's going to happen. What about, Mark asked last night, so what about the person who's standing on the moon, happens to be the time for Kiddush Levana, and the astronaut who's standing there on the moon, can he say it? So the truth is, this is less of a common question. I actually found there is a sefer called Birkat HaLevana. I'm not sure who wrote it, but in it he has a chapter called Adam She'ala Al Ha'im Mevarech Sham Birkat HaLevana. So interesting question. He says a person goes up to the moon, can he say Birkat HaLevana? Now the truth is, you all laugh, but there are many questions that are asked about going up to space, going up on the moon, and these were practical. When Ilan Ramon, the Chol Livracha, was tragically killed on the way back down. But when he was an astronaut, he went up into space, and he went and he consulted. He was trying to figure out when should it be. The big question was, when is Shabbat in space? And when do you keep it? When should he make Kiddush? He actually went and he made Kiddush from the space shuttle. So these questions are asked. So in the Sefer Birkat HaLevana, he writes, also fascinating, even if the question will not be practically relevant for most of us, but the principles that emerge from it. So he writes like this. He says, surprise, surprise. He says, this is not such a common question likely to occur. Nonetheless, he says, he says we can discuss it. Okay, still halachic sugya we can discuss. So he writes that he found in the Shut Mishneh Halachot, he said that it would be forbidden for two reasons. So he talks here a little bit more about the fact. He says going up into space in the first place, that is, he's not so sure that one is allowed to do that. It's a dangerous situation. We have very clear halachot about when a person can, what level of risk is acceptable for a person to take upon themselves, war being an obvious exception. But it's a very, very dangerous thing to go up into space. Actually, once read a book by an astronaut, and he writes there, he describes the training. And he says, when you're training to be an astronaut, when you go up in the rocket, there is one thing that is on your mind all the time. He says the number one question you have to focus, and they teach you to focus on, is what could kill me next? And you have to work around those things in order to. So it's a very dangerous endeavor going up into space. So says the Mishneh Halachot, for those reasons, one shouldn't go up in the first place. But then there's discussion, okay, so if you're on the moon and you're standing on the moon, can you say the bracha, not say the bracha? Right? The big question is, we mentioned before, when would it be Shabbat in space? When would it be Shabbat on the moon? When would you have the Chagim on the moon? If all of our Chagim are who knows, maybe one day these questions will be relevant. But if all of our calendar is based on the moon, based on when we see it and the orbit around, if you're standing on the moon itself, seems to be that it's not that wouldn't apply. And the truth is, these questions about Shabbat, so it's not so common in space, but people that live in places that are very far north or very far south, sometimes when you can have months of daylight at a time, how do we decide where do we know when do they keep Shabbat, etc. So the poskim discuss this based on the same principles for the one on the moon or the one living in these areas as well. In any event, so there's a bit of a back and forth here in the Sefer. He talks about he says one side maybe you would say that since you can only say the bracha, we know only the first half of the month when it's halivana b'chidusha, when the moon is getting bigger again. So it's noticeable. Obviously, the moon doesn't change size; it's always the same. But as it's orbiting around the Earth, and as the Earth is turning on its axis, so we can see from our perspective. From your perspective, it doesn't change. So maybe yes, maybe not. So it's a Shiur. If anybody here is planning on going to the moon anytime soon, you can see not so simple. Ask your local Orthodox rabbi first. But what's also very interesting is that so when the moon landing took place, Rav Kasha wrote a pamphlet called Adam Vayareh, talking about the person on the moon. And he has a short pamphlet which he writes, and he addresses a number of the halachic issues, a number of the ashkafic questions which come up. And he writes there very poetically in the introduction as well. He talks about why he wrote the Sefer, because this event in the late 1960s, right, the space race, this great grand event took place, and all of humanity was mesmerized, and everybody was watching, and everybody was amazed, and everybody was so excited, all of humanity. And the Jews were sitting and thinking, "Oy vavoy, right? What does this mean? What does this mean for us?" People were confused. People didn't understand. He says there was an approach. Why? Because we have different reasons he brings up that led to this confusion, and people asked him, and therefore he decided to write a response, right? Hashamayim shamayim Hashem va'aretz natan lifnei Adam. For example, this is a way of thinking that some people had. They said, up in the heavens, obviously it's not to be taken literally, but people take things literally. But so we have the earth, which is ours, where we have dominion, so to speak, as human beings. But Shamayim is beyond us. It's beyond our reach. It's beyond our grasp. All of a sudden, man is on the moon. Man is in space. Not beyond our grasp anymore. What does that mean? Does it call into question certain things, certain ideas, certain ashkafot, etc.? So he writes about it. Interesting. When the moon landing took place, I think I mentioned here before, but they went to talking about a response. So they went to Rav Kahneman in Bnei Brak, and they asked him what he thought. What was the response? They said, man has reached the moon. So Rav Kahneman went. It's reported that he went over to the window and he looked up at the moon and he looked down at the street and he said, "Yeah, okay, man may have reached the moon, but I'm still waiting for man to reach his fellow man." Meaning, to reach his fellow man. Meaning, we've got all this technology, we can go up and above and beyond and do all these things, but are we first and foremost, are we Bnei Adam? Are we treating each other right? Are we doing the small things? So that's one perspective that he has on it. But so Rav Kasha has, in this book, in this pamphlet, he has different chapters. So there is one chapter in there about Mitzvot, how to fulfill the Mitzvot, and some of the ideas we spoke about, Kiddush Levana, etc. He quotes, there was an opinion, there was somebody who suggested that if a person was to go to the moon, one would be patur from Mitzvot. That there would be no that the Mitzvot were given, it's only on earth, that there would be no obligation. And he proves it. How he proves it, Kasher is not so happy about that. He argues very vehemently. He says, no, you would still be obligated, etc. But he has many more hashkafic chapters as well. And one of them, so he talks about what is the toel, what is the benefit, and what does it mean for us? So man reached the moon. Okay, man reached the moon. What does that mean from a Torah perspective, and what is our response? So he lists a few interesting ideas. And one of them he says he thinks that within this idea of man landing on the moon, there is not only does this not detract from our beliefs and from the Torah's shkafa on the world, but it strengthens the Torah's view on the world. He says one of the ideas, he talks about hashgacha pratit, and he talks about the fact that in the space race between America and Russia, the Soviets, right? So he says, look at this. What was the response when the astronauts and the cosmonauts, when they got up into space and they looked around? What did they say? How did they react? So the cosmonauts, the Russians, they went up and they said, they were entrenched in their beliefs. There is no God. They said, we've been up there. We didn't see him. He's not here. There's nothing out there. That's what they said. That was their reaction. The American astronauts went up, and what was their reaction? They started quoting psukim. They started quoting psukim of Bereshit and psukim of Tehillim and talking about the creation and talking about the beauty, the majesty, etc. of creation. And he says, therefore, this was in a way, this was the war that was going on. Besides the space race, there is this the belief war that's going on behind it as well. And the Americans won. They got to the moon first. He says, maybe there's a message in that. Maybe there's a hint in that. That's Delegasa. So that's one point that he says. He says another point. We know that for many generations, going back, there have been idolaters and avodah zarah. One of the things that people have worshipped, the sun and the moon and the stars, the celestial bodies, etc. Going back, the Rambam in avodah zarah tells us all about how avodah zarah began, and begins, worshipping these things, these celestial bodies. In fact, I saw Rav Lam points out in a drasha that a lot of the names, even that we see in the Chumash, are related to the idea of the moon. He says maybe it's a hint they were worshipping the moon. He says, look at Terah. The name is related to the word Yareach. He says Lavan is related to the word Levana, which is also the moon. Maybe it's to do. Maybe it's an inkling, a hint that there was some to do with that worship. In any event, so people are worshipping the moon, and this is borne out in the Navi as well. And here you go, man is standing all over the moon with something which is far up, it's something which is out there. They're great idols, so to speak, as well. And here we are trampling on it. And that is also maybe gives lends strength to this idea. The final idea, he says many more. The final one, which I'll just mention as well, he says perhaps the most immediate and tangible thing that we can take out of this is he talks about looking at and understanding and recognizing the grandeur and the beauty and the depth of creation, what we can see. You ever seen the pictures from the International Space Station, or from you look at the Earth and you look and you see the wisdom that is there in creation and the planets and the moon, etc. And it's a different level. It's a different level of understanding from what we had before. He quotes the Rambam in Hilchot Yesodei Torah, who talks about what is the way to come to real Ahavat Hashem and Yirat Hashem. And the Rambam goes into great detail in terms of Itbunanut b'Maaseh HaBriah, in terms of examining and looking at what is out there in the world, what is out there in the universe, what is the chokhmah, the tremendous wisdom that is behind it. And that is something which is only enhanced by this endeavor, and by the fact of man going up and seeing the moon and seeing the universe from a new perspective can increase and entrench that idea of Ahava and Yirat Hashem. B'Chananya ben Akasha omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu lezakot Yisrael litfach b'alei mitzvot. Shenema Adonai chavetz zman ziko yagdil Torah v'yadim.